Okay, the next group of pathogens we'll talk about are going to be the protozoa. Now, this is a kingdom that we are often refer to as protista, but we call it protozoa now. Now, protozoa is kind of a weird kingdom or a weird domain because it's made up of a group of organisms that can be unicellular or they can be multicellular. Some of them can photosynthesize like plants, some of them can't, some of them are hunters like animals. So the reason why you're a protist is not because you're a protist, but it's because you're not a plant, you're not an animal, and you're not a fungi, but you're still a eukaryotic cell. So some of them are like animals, some of them are like plants, some are a little bit like fungi. So they're a really diverse group. They're single-celled. They're much bigger than bacteria, and they're predominantly found in aqueous environments. So that means they're going to have water associated with them in some way, shape, or form. Now, we often divide them up into categories based on the way that they move. This might not be genetically the right way to do it, but this is what we've done at first before we had advanced genetics. But we could look at these characteristics, we could see how they moved, and we could group them accordingly. So we've got groups that are what we call amoeboids, the flagellates, the ciliates, and the sporozoans. Now, if we have a look at each one of these groups, first we'll talk about how they might move. So an amoeba is basically a real blob of a cell. It's got a very flexible cell membrane, and it moves by basically sticking out parts of the cell and then looking for food or favorable conditions. And then if they find it, then they move the rest of the cell towards that extension. Now that extension is called a pseudopod. Pod means foot and pseudo means false, so it literally means a false foot. And that's how they move around. They can cause a disease that's really bad, intestinal infection called dysentery. After it's actually quite often called amoebic dysentery, and it can lead to some pretty severe dehydration, really severe diarrhea. They can be a pretty nasty infection. Hard to get. Another thing about protists is they're very hard to treat. Taking drugs for protists, we're attacking not a prokaryotic cell like we would a bacteria, but we're attacking a eukaryotic cell. So very often the drugs that we take to fight a protist will actually attack our cells as well. So the drugs we take can be very harsh when we're trying to fight a protist infection. A second group there are the ciliates, and as you guys can imagine, these guys will move around by those modified hairs on the outside that we call cilia. And these are generally more environmental as opposed to pathogenic, so they rarely cause diseases in humans. Another group that we have are the flagellates, and these of course move by flagella. And these can be quite parasitic. The group or the organism that causes African sleeping sickness is a type of flagellate. And then the last ones are the sporozoans. These are the ones that have no movement generally. They're obligate parasites, and they will need a vector or a living organism to move them around so that they can complete their life cycle, so they can reproduce, and also so that it can cause infection. Probably the best example of a sporozoan is malaria. And this species is known because it's propagated or it's moved around by the vector known as the tsetse fly. This next slide is going to show us a couple of pictures of each one of these groups. So over here we've got the amoeboids, and you can see these projections of the cytoplasm here. Those are going to be the pseudopods, or the false foot. On this side over here, we've got the ciliates, and you can see the cilia around them that help them move around. Down here, we get an organism. It's a flagellate, but the organism is called Giardia. And this can cause, I'll underline that because it's a Latin name. This can cause a pretty bad intestinal infection that we call, very often they call, where I'm from, they call it beaver fever, because it's carried in the feces of rodents, and typically beavers. And then the last one down here, this is going to be our sporozoan, and these are going to be the malaria parasites here. You can see them inside the red blood cells, and their vector is, of course, the tsetse fly, a mosquito, type of mosquito, and that can spread malaria around all over. Very dangerous vector. Probably the most dangerous animal on the entire planet is the mosquito, because it's a vector for so many different types of diseases. Now, we can have some other organisms that cause disease, and some of these can be in the kingdom Animalia, which is the same kingdom that we're in. Specifically, when we're talking about parasitic organisms of animals, we're talking about the roundworms and the flatworms. And we find them in groups called phylums, and the phylum Nematoda is the roundworm, and the phylum Platyhelminthes is the flatworms. Now, if we look at that word, platy is Latin for flat, and helminths is the name for worms. So Platyhelminthes, that's literally flatworms. So here's an example of a flatworm. Two examples of flatworms. On the left, we have the liver fluke. This organism is going to spend half of its life cycle in a secondary host, a pig or a cow or a goat or sheep, and where it'll live part of its life cycle, its eggs will be deposited in the feces of the of that particular animal, and then if that feces contaminates our food or water, we can drink that, and then it'll finish out the rest of its life cycle in our digestive tract, and very often it'll move to the liver, where it can cause some serious damage. On the right hand side over here, we get a tapeworm. And these are long worms, and they can live in our digestive systems for a long period of time. They can actually be several meters in length as they snake down through our intestines. And they have a head right here that we call a scolex, and that attaches itself somewhere in the intestinal wall. And then it's very segmented. You can see all the segments here. They stack on top. As you move further towards the back, those segments are basically just for reproduction. So they produce millions and millions of eggs that are released through our feces, with the hopes of they finding their way into food or drinking water, and they get themselves back into another host. They can live in our bodies for a long time, and they can cause not only malnutrition, where they're stealing the food from us that we're trying to eat, but they can also cause some pretty serious secondary infections because they burrow their way into the side of our digestive tract. So here's a look at some roundworms that we can have. So these are the phylum Nematoda. Probably the most common roundworm that's a human pathogen is Ascaris lumbricoides. And we'll find Ascaris living in our intestines, and they can be quite long. We've got one in the microbiology lab. I think that's around 30 centimeters long, and about maybe a half a centimeter, 3/4 of a centimeter in diameter. So they're a big worm, and you can find them in our intestines. And a really big infection would be down here in D, and you can see that these are hundreds, probably thousands of these worms living in our digestive tract, and they can cause problems. They can actually get so many that they can block our digestive tract, and that can cause big trouble. That could even be fatal if it's not fixed. So they're a bit of a concern that way. We'll also have these hookworms, and they're called hookworms because you can see these hooks at the top of their proboscis, their anterior end, and they'll hook themselves into our digestive system and then feed off of our food as it passes through. And then we can have these other ones that are called filarial worms, and you'll find those in our blood. They circulate through our circulatory system, and they can get caught in capillaries and just nasty spots that can cause severe damage to our circulatory system, as well as secondary infections and so on and so forth. So that's a look at the different groups of pathogens that we can expect to find that cause disease in humans.